Dr. Johnson, what are you doing here, man? I almost killed you.
Oh, I was just trying to get a little exercise while practicing social distancing. What are you doing here, Dr. Mays?
I was doing my pastoral patrol. Hey, I could use some help. Why don't you come join me?
All right, let's go.
Hey, since you're here with me, I have a couple of questions, and I bet some other people would like to know these answers. You're an Old Testament professor and the director of the Honors College, so you're a smart guy, so I'm sure you'll know the answers. So as an Old Testament professor and expert, is there anything from the Old Testament that we could learn about that would teach us about what's going on during this pandemic?
Question. The thing that comes to my mind most readily would be the story in the book of Daniel. I know there's not diseases involved, but as I was thinking about our current situation and the Old Testament, the book of Daniel really came to mind. And that's because in some ways, Daniel and his friends are living in a situation that's pretty similar to ours. They're not dealing with a disease, they're dealing with an empire, but they're in the same situation in that Daniel and his friends live in a world where their world has been turned upside down. Daniel and his friends live in a world where it's hard to see that God is in control, in the same way that we're living in a world where our world has been turned upside down. You know, our normal patterns of life don't exist anymore. And when we're dealing with a pandemic on this level, it's hard to see that God is in control. So it seems to me that's an interesting analogy.
Well, that's great, man, looking toward Daniel and his friends. So what can we learn from that story?
Well, it seems to me that Daniel and his friends had to learn a couple of things in dealing with their new world. The first thing that they had to learn was, what does it mean to be faithful to God when the world doesn't look like it normally looks? And for them, that was, keeping a kosher diet, or not praying to the idols, or being faithful to only pray to God. And, it got them in trouble, but it was one of the things they had to learn when their normal way of being faithful to God wasn't possible. How do we, in this new environment, learn to be faithful to God? And I think we have to do the same thing. We can't go to church the same way. We can't be community the same way. But how do we continue to be faithful in this new world? And the second thing they had to learn was to continue to trust in God when it doesn't look like God's in control of things. For Daniel and his friends, it looks like the other empires are in control. And for us, similar, it's hard to look around the world today and say, man, is God really in control? Things seem decidedly out of control, and we have to find a way to trust that God is in control. And that's one of the things that Daniel and his friends learn, is that even when it doesn't look like God is in control, he very clearly is. And that's our hope, and I think that has to continue to be our message, that even when it doesn't look like it, God really is in control, even in a world that's racked by the coronavirus.
Man, Ben, that's great. And you talked about God being in control or not in control, and how do we understand that? But here's another question I've been hearing, and quite frankly wondering for myself. Some people want to say that this pandemic is God's judgment. And so, talking from an Old Testament perspective particularly, how do we think about things like this? Is it really God's judgment?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair one to think about. I mean, the Old Testament includes stories where God uses plague and disease as punishment. You think about what he does to the Egyptians in the Exodus, or he even punishes David through plague because of his sinful census. But I think I would caution about thinking that. And the reason that I'm cautious about it is thinking about the book of Job. Job experiences absolute tragedy, including a plague on himself, including natural disasters against his family. And his friends come and they're trying to wrestle with it and understand, what does this mean? And they are constantly saying, Job, you clearly must have sinned. This is punishment on you. And Job sticks to his guns and says, I have not. This isn't punishment on me. And the book of Job is wrestling with that reality. And it strikes me that we should be real cautious about applying God's punishment as what's going on here. I think rather what Job's friends do is they apply, good reasoning and in some ways good theology to the wrong situation. It's okay to say that bad deeds do sometimes lead to bad consequences. It's a very Book of Proverbs perspective, but it's applied in the wrong moment by Job's friends. And I'd be afraid that thinking about the coronavirus as punishment might be a good thought applied to the wrong moment. And so I'd be really cautious with claiming that we could say that. I'd rather think about the hope that we have, and whether that's an Old Testament perspective of a hope of new creation and new heavens and new earth, where pain, mourning, and suffering is not going to be part of the situation anymore. I think that's probably the better message to bring, rather than trying to decide whether or not this is God's judgment, but remembering that we have a hope that tragedy such as the coronavirus is not the end of the story. In fact, the picture of the end of the story is one without this kind of tragedy that we're experiencing right now.
Wow, Ben, thanks. Man, I'm glad I almost ran you over. Your message that you're sharing there from the Old Testament about ending with hope, or actually not ending with hope, but actually living into the hope, is a good one, and one that I'm going to remember, and I hope everybody else remembers too. Well, I think we're back where we started.
Okay, well, thanks for the lifts. I guess I'll take off here and finish my run. See ya.
All right.